All right, a question from William from the MBT forum is a question on truth. I'll read the original question, and since I know you don't tell stories of non-physical experiences, I'll paraphrase the question to something different. In terms of your key learnings, can you enumerate some of the explicit truths where you were told, some of the explicit truths you were told, and by whom? A few stories would be interesting. I'll paraphrase it to, what big truths have you discovered in your explorations of consciousness, if that's better for you?
Okay, Donna, I can answer that question. It brings up one interesting point. I have a lot of people ask me about how I got this information about my big toe. And many people have the idea that it was given to me. It was information that I was told, as this question that you read implies. That's not the case. It's not at all like, I go into the non-physical and some, wise being comes up and explains to me how reality works, and then I go write it down in my book. It didn't work like that at all. It can't work like that. The reason it can't work like that is that if that happened, then I would be in the position of either believing what they told me or not believing what they told me. It wouldn't be something that I knew. It wouldn't be mine. So I couldn't go around giving lectures and talking to people and answering questions. It was just a matter of I got a lot of information that somebody told me. That wouldn't work. Now, I really wouldn't understand it. I'd just be repeating what I was told. So the system doesn't work that way because that's not a good way to impart information. The system tends to be set up to give you opportunities to figure it out for yourself. In other words, you might get a nudge. You might be given an experience that if you learn something from that experience, it will help you then see a bigger picture. And that experience might be handed to you by the larger consciousness system, but understanding it and coming up with the bigger picture has to happen from the inside out. You have to do that yourself. So the way I got information, or the way I ended up with the information that's in my books and in my talks, is I had to figure it out for myself. I had to basically do research. I had to think about it. I did analysis. I kept trying to come up with a model that would explain everything. It's easy to come up with a model that explains 10% of it or 20% of it. It's much harder to come up with a model that explains everything. So it took a long time. I worked on this for 35, 40 years before I started putting, more like 35, before I started putting pen to paper and thinking I had figured out enough of it to actually start writing. And then during the writing process, a whole lot more of it became clear because I was spending so much time thinking about, how it worked. How to express that to other people got clearer and clearer with time as well. So I wasn't told things. I figured things out, mostly from my experience. And a large part of that experience was experience in the larger consciousness system, or experience in the non-physical virtual realities. And of course, non-physical is just relative to us because it's not our reality. We see our reality as physical and everything else is non-physical. But it's not like our physical reality is the main one and the non-physical realities are somehow, not as important. It doesn't work like that. All realities are equally real. It's just the one that you're in is the one that seems to be physical at the time. So anyhow, because I was able to go to what we would see as non-physical realities and do research there and see how does it work, and if I do this, what happens? It was that kind of thing that allowed me to finally figure out how the thing must work. You have enough data points, eventually you find the pattern in the data points and see the connections between them and then come up with the idea of how it all works so that one understanding explains everything. So the first part to answer this question is, I wasn't told. I figured it out. But did I figure it out with help? Of course, I was given experiences and nudged to have the interest in it. I ended up with Bob and Rowe, who got me on the track of experiencing in the larger conscious system. All those things fell together, and probably not entirely just random chance. All those things happened. Probably was some nudging going on in there that set a lot of that up. So yes, I've had help in that sense, but not in the sense of being given the answers. Okay, now secondly, what are some of these, I'll call them kind of breakthrough concepts, aha moments that came to me as I figured this thing out. Because as I say, I didn't figure it out, in a day. I figured it out over many, many years. So it was a slow process with a whole lot, probably 30 or 40 things that hit me, and aha, and then you figure, you figured something out that made a little more connections, was a little more general a model than what you had before, and it made a little better sense. And then, maybe a year later you'll get another one, and so on. So I have 15 of them that I've written down here. I was asked a question when I was being interviewed by a group called Blue Sky Symposium, and this was a few years ago. And I was asked a question about some of the breakthrough moments that I've had, and if these might be useful to other people. I think they might be. So I'd just like to read through them. These are some of the big ideas that came to me in my process. And I don't have them in any particular order. They just are the order to which they came to me as I was writing them down. So they're not necessarily chronological or in order of importance or anything like that. They're just the order in which they appeared in my mind when I picked up my pen. Okay, number 1. Let understanding and value flow to you as a result of fixing yourself. If you chase it with your intellect, you are unlikely to find it. In other words, if you fix yourself, if you grow up, if you lower your own entropy, then the rest of your problems will tend to solve themselves. Your growing up will become more accelerated. If you chase it with your intellect, oh, I want to grow up, I need to act like this, I need to act like that, I need to not have this fear, and if it remains just in your intellect, and if you're pursuing it, it's not as likely to happen as if you just work on yourself rather than on your technique for going out of body or on helping little old ladies across the street. Just work not on the doing aspect, but on the being aspect. And as you are successful in the being aspect, and you will be successful in the being aspect if you, 1, really have the desire to do it, and 2, consistently work on it, consistently have the intent to succeed, to get rid of that fear, to get rid of that ego. If you have that, then you will change yourself. You will get rid of fear at the being level, and as you do, all the rest of the things that you want to understand and experience will begin to flow naturally. Okay, number 2 is information about physical objects or beings exists independently of those objects or beings and is usually available, open source. I came to that understanding after I first started to see auras around people, and then I saw them around things and around even things, living things like trees and things, and then I started seeing them around mechanical, power lines and calculators and that sort of thing. And it took me a while to figure out just what these things were. What were these metaphors for? What was behind them? What was actually the data that I was interpreting as these images, and where did it come from, and so on. And I realized one day that I could see these auras around people from a photograph of people just as easily as I could if I looked at the person. And then I realized that I could see them just as easily without the photograph, just with an intent to see it. So that series of kind of ahas from the I see the aura to I can see it around photographs of things to I don't need a photograph. I don't need anything but my intent. That led me to this information about physical objects or beings exists independently of those objects and beings. So that aura is not attached to your body. It has really nothing to do with your body. You see, it's information. Information in a database, and you can access it with your intent. If it were actually something attached to your body, then you wouldn't see it in a picture, and you wouldn't see it without the picture. So that was a major step up, and that was very early in my understanding this thing. One of the earlier steps I took. Number 3 is that in non-physical reality, that is non-physical virtual realities, becoming aware in these non-physical virtual realities does not have to be foggy, nor do you have to sneak up on it or ease into it with process and ritual. No transition process is actually required. This is a big one. That was a big one for me because I started out at the lab, and of course we started with this relaxation exercises. First you relax your feet and then your legs and so on up, and this was to put you into an alpha state. So we had all this process that had to go on, and then of course we developed the binaural beats, and we listened to those, and the concept then was to go to sleep and still be aware. Of course, that sounds like a contradiction because one of the definitions of being asleep is that you're no longer aware, but that was the idea. You were supposed to go to sleep and be aware. So what I did, and what a lot of people, and most people do, I started kind of going to the sleep state in the sense that I wanted to fog out of this physical reality. So I let this physical reality go, and as the physical reality went, my awareness got foggier and foggier. In other words, I got less and less connected to this reality. And as I did, it's like I visualized that, or my metaphor for that was that everything was less and less succinct, less and less detailed. In other words, the information got really grainy and not very detailed anymore because I really wasn't paying attention to it. And you drift off into that fog of letting go of this reality. The problem with that is that now you're in a fog. Your mental state is kind of floating in a fog and not real clear and not real active, and it's hard to take control at that point because you're now just floating in the fog. And with some experiments that I did, and I did these mostly out in the lab, I realized that that's wrong. You don't have to be foggy. You don't need a process. You don't have to start with relaxation. You don't need a binaural beat. You don't need to sit in a particular posture, or sit in a chair, or lie down, or stand on one foot, or burn incense, or ring a bell. Any of the processes that people associate with meditation and kind of disconnecting your awareness from this physical matter reality are not necessary. They're all just tools that you use. There is no transition process required. It's all in the matter of your intent. And once I learned that lesson, through experiments, I convinced myself that if I dropped all the process and just kept a clear head, just like I was awake in this physical reality with no difference, I was still just as awake. Never went through the foggy state. Just went from one awake state to another totally awake state, and I just felt totally awake. I didn't have that feeling of fog. But I was in a different reality system now that was possible just with intent, and that all the rest of it was unnecessary ritual, process, and things that we get habituated to. And that enabled me to do it much quicker. So if you don't need all that process, then you can go from being in this reality to another reality in tenths of seconds. You realize it's just intent, and you're liberated from all the ritual that people use to make that transition. Lying down, seeing people have all kinds of things. Bob rolled out of body. People climb up ropes to get out of body. They stick their arms up to see their out of body arms. They have lots and lots of different, floating. Some of them lift up like on a fluid. They've got all these tools and all the meditation rituals to get into that state, and I found out that none of it was necessary. Non-physical reality is just it's just a different focus. You're basically connecting to a different data stream. Let this data stream go, and you start with another data stream. And that's it. You're there. You don't need the process. Number 4, the history databases are populated by probabilistic models without free will. You are a probabilistic model with the free will, that is the consciousness and the awareness, to interact within an experiential VR. Okay, now, I figured this out, I don't know, probably midway through the process, or maybe even a little later, maybe 2/3 of the way through the process, when repeat visits to these databases, many people call them Akashic records or something. This is a virtual reality. It's a probabilistic reality. And because it's virtual, it's data, and because of that, the data is safe. It's helpful. These the future and past databases are functional to the working of the reality. So the data is collected. And when I went to these, I at first was under the idea that these were like living realities. These were maybe separate parallel realities going on, but then that really didn't make sense either, because then that wads up time and process and learning. Learning's cumulative. You can't just jump around and same things don't just keep repeating, over and over again. So it just didn't, it couldn't line up as logical. So then I started doing some experiments of changing a variable, going there, saying a very similar thing, but change a variable, change a word in a request to the database, and see what happened. And, I get something that changed relative to that word. If I said exactly, when I say said, I means when I had the intent that was exactly the same, I'd get the exact same information. Now, when I mean information, it's like being there. It's not like just getting information back from Google. It's like you're there. You're interacting with people. You're in a place, and there's maybe dozens of people, and you're one of them, and you're interacting. If you make the exact same choices, say the exact same things at the exact same time, you will get all the exact same responses from all these people in the process that you're in. So that let me know that it wasn't people with free will, because people with free will do different things, different times, even to the same stimulus. They're not always that precise that they will say or do exactly the same thing given that stimulus. People aren't that repetitive. They're probably 50, 60, 70% repetitive, but not 100%. And that's what I found. Now that means I had to be able to go to these places many times, 20, 30, 40, 50 times, and go there with exactly the same intent. And intent is not only in your intellectual awareness, it's also at the being level. You have emotional intents as well. You may not be aware of them, but you have them, and they will affect the results that you get back. So your intellectual intent is probably like first choice, but that is modified by your emotional intent. So you eliminate other variables, and then it's just a matter of doing this enough times, changing the variables in certain ways, changing a word in your intent, and then doing that the same way many times. So it just took a lot of time to repeat and do experiments there, but that's how I came to that conclusion. Now, there's one interesting thing to talk about here, and that is often when I say that these databases, which is where most of the mediums, they're talking to people who have died, whatever, they're mostly talking to these databases. That's probably the 95% of it. And mostly they don't like that concept that they're actually interfacing with a database, because they feel like they're interfacing with a real, a real being, not this fake database being. Point is, there's very little difference between a real being and a fake database being. They're really the same being. One of them, okay, is in a database. The other one, take that same information that's in that database that defines that being in that database, and take that information and let that play in an experiential virtual reality. Let all of the, all of the probabilities that define that person over their entire history play in a experiential virtual reality, and basically now you got your real live being. So you see, the only difference between a being in a database and a being that's working in a virtual reality as we are, that the one working in the virtual reality we are is making choices. By virtue of being in a virtual reality, you have free will. You make choices. There's no point in being in a virtual reality if you don't make choices, right? Then you're a rock. You're not a being. If you're a being, you're there to interact and make choices. That means you have a free will to do that. If you're in a database, you're just the data that represents that being. Okay, now that data that represents that being is not just their, height, weight, and serial number. It's everything about them, every emotion, every thought, all of that stuff goes together to produce a probabilistic model of an individual. Take that probabilistic model out of the database, put it in a experiential VR where choices need to be made according to that probable being and how they would probably make that, and then you have a different thing. So we give that being free will to make choices any way they wish. Okay, but yet that free will, this, what do we call it, a free will awareness unit. This free will awareness unit basically defined in its initial start by information. In other words, the larger conscious system is an information system. So what are we? We are information. We're a set, a folder, if you will, of ones and zeros that define us, all the choices we've made, the way we are, our emotions, our feelings, everything about us, our love, our ego, our fear, all of that's there. And then we're given choices when we get into virtual reality, and based on everything that we are and everything we've done, we make new choices, because these choices are things we've never done. They're new experiences. You can't just go and pull something out of the bag and say, oh, last time I acted like this, I'll just do it again because I'm really not interested in learning. You have a new experience. You have to look at all the look at all the facts, look at all the fears, look at all the things that are there, and who you are and what you've done, and then you make choices. And if those choices lower entropy, then you grow up. If they raise entropy, then you don't grow up, you de-evolve. So that's the way it works. So this idea about the entities in the database aren't real entities, they're very close. If you only look at the defining the entity as it was, then they are a duplicate of the real. It's just that they are not actively interacting within a database. Therefore, they're not growing, they're not learning, they're not becoming more. They're just a copy of what that being was in that lifetime. You see, they're a fixed set of that data. That data is no longer growing with the new experience being added, because the free will component isn't there in the database. Right. So let's see, where was I? I was number 4. All right, number 5. Consciousness is the only active ingredient. The rest is belief, ritual, or tools. Okay. So that takes us back to this one about when you meditate or when you're going out of body, whatever. You don't need all the ritual, and you don't need the tools. Well, let me say that differently. You might need them, but they're not fundamental. Okay? The rituals, you might need them because you're habituated to them and you can't do it any other way. Then use them. It's not that tools and rituals are bad. It's just you have to see that they're tools and rituals. They're not fundamental. They're things that you have made up in order to help you focus your intent in the way that you need to focus it to get the result that you're looking for. Okay. So that's a very simplifying idea. Consciousness is the only active ingredient. The rest is belief, rituals, or tools, and that's true of anything you see. Whatever an individual might be doing, however they're doing it, that simplifies it. Consciousness is really the active ingredient. And number 6, for the most part, you create your own personal reality, and we create our own collective reality. What you are drives what you experience and what you do. So that's pretty obvious. I talk a lot about that in the books, but that was an aha moment for me early on when I realized that it's not that there is, well, there's two parts to this, I guess. There is a reality out there, and you are interacting with it, but you are interpreting that data that you get that defines this reality in terms of your own experience. That means you are creating a reality in terms of your own experience. You're also creating your own reality in terms of how you interact with others, because that changes how others interact with you. That changes the nature of the reality you live in. So, third way you interact, you create your own reality is you have intent. You modify future probability. And it's not just future probability for you, but that future probability that you're modifying affects others. So we have lots of people all interacting, affecting each other, nudging probabilities up and down, and out of all that mix, we create our own collective reality, just as we create our own personal reality. So if you don't like the way your life is, then you're the one that needs to change. It's not that you fix things in your life by fixing all the outside stuff because you're nearly perfect as you are. You just need to get all the rest of this outside stuff lined up so that it works for you. If your life is having issues, the fix to those issues, the solution lies inside of you, changing what's inside of you, not changing what's outside of you. Now, there are, you can come up with examples that are contrary to that very general statement, but for the most part, that is the way it is. 7, you must take full responsibility for your present quality of consciousness. It is precisely what you have made it. You need to own it the way you are, because by all the choices you've made, through all the experiences you've had, you are you. You have created you. And if you want to create a different you, then you have to change your intent, change the way you make choices. In other words, you can't blame anybody else for your issues or even for your unhappiness or anything else in your life. Just everything is your responsibility. Not well, when I make generalizations, people sometimes get confused. When I say everything's your responsibility, I don't mean that somebody stubbed their toe in Africa today is your responsibility. I mean that your growth, the way the world is, your interaction with it, your life, results of your life, your growth, all of that is just your responsibility. And saying that, well, I'd do a lot better if it wasn't for, and start naming all the things in your environment that make it difficult for you, that is not the case. You can outgrow, you can overcome those things in your environment. They are there making it difficult for you because you have created them as well. See? So you stop creating those things. And on the surface, you'd say, well, I didn't create any of that. That's these other people. I can't control that. The bigger picture, you do create it. You're there because that's where all of your choices have led you, to be there in that situation with those people. Made different choices, you'd be in a different place. We're on 8 now. There are very few free handouts given by the larger consciousness system. One must earn one's way to produce change at the being level. Doing, wishing, wanting, and expecting are of marginal value if you cannot convert them into change at the being level. This was a big lesson, and it basically focuses on the fact that there is a big difference between acting and being. You can act out a part of nice guy or even a bad guy. You can act out a part, but acting it out, doing it from the intellect, is what I mean by acting it out, is very different than being it. In other words, you help that little old lady across the street because it's just the right thing to do, not because your intellect tells you that that's what you should be doing, even though you'd really rather do something else. You say, oh, all right, I'll help her because that's really what I ought to do. You help her because you help her. There's no other thing for you to do. You just do that because that's what, that's how you are. You help people when you see a need like that and you're in a situation to help them. You don't do it because your intellect tells you that you should. For the most part, this is a similar one. This is number 9. For the most part, you get what you need and what you deserve. That is, you get the challenges you need to grow in a form that you have earned, in a form that's appropriate for you. And you get it just as you need it and or just as you deserve it. Okay, this reality evolves and grows and lowers its entropy as you evolve and grow and lower your entropy. So you're part of the larger system's process for its own evolution. Thus, the system wants you to succeed, and the system will help you succeed in as much as it can. But it is not going to give you answers, just like I talked about in the very first part of this. It's not going to tell you, here's what you need to do, and here's how you need to do it. That wouldn't really be of any help to you at the being level. Even if you did those things just as you were told, you'd just be following orders. You wouldn't be growing up. You see, you have to do it for yourself. So this reality tends to give you what you need and what you deserve. And if you think this reality is giving you a lot of crap, it's probably because that's what you deserve. That's what you've created for yourself. That's where you have put yourself. Okay. So that's what I mean by you get what you need and you deserve. Now, that isn't always the case. Sometimes there's just random stuff going on. Sometimes you're just driving down the street and somebody swerves across the lane and hits you head on, and now you're dead or you're a cripple or something else. That wasn't necessarily because that's what you needed and what you deserved. It's just a random occurrence. You're in a reality with a lot of other, free will awareness units, and all of the units affect each other. So, in general, in the big picture, in the bigger flow, in the more fundamental sense of it, things will happen to you that are what you need and what you deserve. Okay? So, deal with them in a good way, and what you will need and deserve will be more pleasant things, because more pleasant things are things you can use to grow. Many people can only grow through pain. If their life is pleasant, then they just kick back and don't need to grow. They say everything's fine. So that's kind of the idea there, and that was a big one for me, because I realized that it's not that I have to do the right things or be in the right place or associate with the right knowledgeable people. All that's secondary. I can do everything I need to do to maximize my growth just with my intent. Okay, number 10. Control is an illusion. You have the most control over your life and events when you give up trying to control or manipulate anything. Life unfolds perfectly for you if you stop letting your fear, ego, and belief interfere with the natural unfolding process. Harmony is the natural state. Just get out of the way with your fear and ego and expectations and beliefs and let it happen. Okay? As life happens, deal with it as it happens. Maximize what you can learn from it, grow as much as you can, and go on to the next thing that happens. See? If you try to control it, say, here's what I want to happen, and I'm going to put all my energy into making that happen, you are putting the emphasis at the wrong end of the process called, experience. Trying to manipulate the experience that happens rather than learn as much as you can from whatever that experience is. All right, number 11. Most everyone is doing the best that they can. I mean that practically, not theoretically. Theoretically, we could all do a whole lot better, but practically, we're mostly doing the best we can with the tools and abilities that we have. Thus, we're all pretty much in the same boat, struggling with our respective challenges, and accordingly, we should treat each other with love and compassion rather than anger, frustration, or condescension. When you look at people and make fun of them, when you look at people and feel like, well, I'm a whole lot more evolved than that one, you have anger for all the stupid people and the trouble they cause you. You see, frustration. That's your ego. Everybody here is struggling with what they are, who they are, and how they are, and trying to do what they can to get by. We have an innate, fundamental desire, encouragement, imperative to grow up, to become love. There's that thing in us that's pushing us toward bigger understanding and higher quality. That's why we have so many seekers. Why do they seek? Because they have this urge to know, to find out, to become all that they can be. And that's really a fundamental thing that all humanity has. Actually, not just humanity. It's conscious entities have that because that's why they're here. They're here to grow up and learn, and they have that basic motivation to do that, and that's just part of them. Okay, so doesn't mean people can't go the other way, or they can't decide that they're going to take the low road, or they're going to get the things they need by ripping off other people. Those are conscious decisions that are made that lead to de-evolution. But whether people do that or not, they still have something in them that urges them on to evolving toward love. Because most of us ignore it most of the time. Override that with who we really are, kind of overrides that a lot of the time. All right. 12. Growing up is not about doing. It is about being. Growth, consciousness evolution, must take place at the being level rather than the intellectual level. Well, that was a major aha moment for me because, I'm a left brain intellectual sort of physicist when I started in all this thing back in the early 1970s. That was my life. I was very much like your typical young physicist at that time, and my intellect was my life. My intellect defined my reality. If I couldn't get my intellect around it, then it really didn't exist for me. I couldn't talk about it. I couldn't use words. I couldn't describe it. So everything flowed through the intellect. That's kind of a typical left brain Western attitude. And our culture rewards that left brain dominance. It's, the professionals, the people who are taking home the fattest paychecks, are the people who are what are called intellectual workers, people who use their experience, their mind, their creative abilities to problem solve. These are the ones that go to the top in our culture, because that's what our culture today values most. But when you realize that the doing, the intellectual control, just not really where growth is. The growth is about who you are. It's about getting rid of your fear. And that's not about controlling. It's not that you control your behavior so you don't act fearful. It's about getting rid of your fear. You see, control isn't the thing. You have to let that control be and just be who you are. And when you be, you're just doing. You're living in the moment. You're expressing yourself as you are. Then you're assessing that. And if you don't like it, then you need to change who you are, not change your behavior. Okay, so growth has to take place at the being level. You can't get there by intellectually deciding to go. Now, your intellect can guide the way, can point the direction, and can get you started. But if you don't convert that into being level change, then it's not going to really cause you to grow up much. Maybe probably cause you more frustration. Like, I'm doing all this stuff that I read about. I'm going through all the prescriptions I know of, and I haven't changed much. Well, that's because you're approaching it from the intellect. You're doing rather than being. All right, number 13. The way the consciousness evolution game works is that stuff happens. We get to choose how we deal with it. We evolve or de-evolve according to that choice. Each of us makes hundreds, probably thousands of small choices every day. Everything we do is a choice, and everything that we do is done because of an intent that motivates it. We have an intention. And that intention is the key, not really the doing. Okay, so what we should be doing is not trying to manipulate the stuff that happens, but to focus on doing the best we can at how we choose to deal with it. Then that will optimize our rate of evolution. When you begin to let go of controlling what happens and focus on how you deal with it, your whole life will take a dramatic change. Things will get easier, and you'll find that all the things that you were struggling with to control actually work out really well just the way they are. And then you realize that all of that struggle that you've been doing to control them and make them come out the way you want them has actually been what's been messing them up for the most part. You're creating your own problems. That takes us right back to you create your own reality, and if it's not the way you like it, it's probably you, not your environment. All right. Number 14, physical reality is an illusion. All is consciousness. What we call PMR, physical matter reality, is an evolving digital simulation that produces the constraints and interaction that free will awareness units like us must follow. And that free will awareness unit is just a subset of another entity we call an individuated unit of consciousness. That's us. And we take some part of that IUOC, individuated unit of consciousness, and that's what we play. That's the part of us that's actively, engaged in making choices in this particular virtual reality. Okay, so that's what we call then the free will awareness unit. Okay, it's all digital, and that was probably an idea that came later. That was probably somewhere at the, near the 30 34, 35-year mark before I started writing. That was a big aha, because suddenly when I realized that it was all about information, and that information is computed, it's about analysis and computation. It's all about information. Then it's a virtual reality, it's a simulation, and then lots of data that was out there that I couldn't actually connect the dots between suddenly fell in together, making everything make more sense. Okay, let's see. The very last one. We're down to number 15. Physics and metaphysics, ethics and morality, mind and matter, normal and paranormal, ontology and theology all follow the same rules and are derived from the same basic understanding. They're all derived from first principles. And these first principles are basically the first principles of what is consciousness. How does consciousness work? This digital information field that's consciousness. Once you understand the fundamentals of consciousness, those same fundamentals will derive physics as well as metaphysics. Those same fundamentals will tell you what ethics is, what's moral and what's not moral. The things are ethical or moral based on whether or not they raise or lower the entropy of the system. You'll see how mind and matter are connected. It's not this big mystery that mind and matter seem to be two separate things that don't mix. Matter is virtual. Mind or consciousness is fundamental. Mind, being fundamental, creates virtual realities that then can be interpreted as matter. So you can work out a lot of logical conclusions about that. Normal and paranormal. See, the paranormal becomes normal. It's not paranormal. Paranormal means beyond and above normal. Normal doesn't explain it. Once you understand these basic first principles of consciousness, there is no paranormal. Everything's just normal. Ontology, that's the study of being. Theology, all of these are derivable. The results of all of these follow from the very same rules. So the same rules that let you understand the double slit experiment also let you understand normal and paranormal and ontology and theology. That's the idea of a big toe. One, understanding that from that basic understanding with just a couple of assumptions, everything else is made understandable. Then all the dots get connected between all the various experiments and all the little pieces of data that's been collected over a lifetime. You find that you can connect them all. You start with just these few simple ideas and concepts. And that was probably one of the last ones. That was number 15 here, and it probably was somewhere toward the end. I got to that maybe about the time I was putting pen to paper, deciding I'd write all this down. So, the last two, physical reality is an illusion. And to understand it, everything falls into place. That was toward the end. Well, there it is. That spans probably about 35 years worth of thinking about these things, and that's a few of there's probably some I didn't put down that I forgot that I would add. Anyway, that is a list of things that were aha moments to me, things that made a big difference, kind of made a sharp turn in where you were going with your life and growth and understanding of how everything works. So hopefully these will mean something to you as well.